Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, this is Dr. Keith McNally, and this is the Question Guy podcast. And once again, I love saying it because I've made it through so much. This is season 2 of the Question Guy podcast, and I'm here with Kent Sanders, and we're going to talk about a topic I've never talked about before, and it's quite intriguing to me, and it's ghostwriting. So let's have that conversation now because Kent, you are a ghostwriter. Am I correct?
That is correct. You got it.
So let's talk about how you got into that and what is ghostwriting all about? But I would love to know your backstory because you didn't really start out as a ghostwriter. I think as I'm talking to different writers and those who say they're ghostwriters, they don't necessarily graduate college and say, I'm going to be a
Right.
ghostwriter. It kind of
Right.
evolves into that through a series of steps. What's what did it how did it all come to be for you?
Well, and that's actually a really good observation. Whenever you talk to people who are ghostwriters, one thing that you almost never hear is, I always wanted to be a ghostwriter, or something that they set out to do career-wise.
Right.
A phrase that oftentimes people use when they're talking about how they get into ghostwriting is that they stumbled into it. You hear that a lot. And I found that was really accurate in my situation too, because I always had heard of ghostwriters, but it was not something that was on my radar screen at all. From the time I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer. In fact, I
Oh,
can
so you
remember,
knew that about yourself.
oh,
Like
absolutely. I'd
that's
always
the part of you.
totally, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that was my primary identity from the time I was a teenager, really was that I was a musician and I was a writer.
Huh?
I was never a sports person. I was never, a math or science person really, but the arts, specifically playing guitar and drums, those are my two main instruments.
So you're creative. You're very
Oh,
creative.
totally. I was always
Okay.
involved in high school. I was the kid who was in choir and band and theater and drama and all that stuff. I loved it. That's what I lived and breathed. That was
Cool.
my whole identity.
But ghostwriting wasn't like did you
No, I
even know
didn't even
what
know that was a
ghostwriting
thing.
was when you were
No, I had no idea.
okay.
Back in, this would have been back in the late 80s, early 90s when I was in high school.
Right, right.
And then I'd always felt a spiritual calling on my life to go into church ministry. Never considered anything else vocationally. And which might sound kind of odd, because if my main identity that I felt was as a creative, artsy kind of a person, but then I felt this spiritual calling to go into the church world vocationally,
Hmm.
I didn't know how those things were going to get mixed. In fact, I didn't think that they would. I
You
grew up in a
mean writing in ministry or music in ministry?
both. I had no idea how writing or music would play a part in any kind of a church thing.
Okay.
When I was in high school, I led worship a lot. I sang a lot, those kinds of things. But I didn't have any idea that that could actually be a part of a church ministry kind of a deal. I grew up in a really small country church in southern Missouri, was very involved in it. And all that I knew in terms of, if you wanted to go into church ministry as a job, my only options that I knew of were, you could be a preacher, because
Okay.
that was all that I knew.
Okay.
We had one preacher at our church, and that was it.
Well, you said
But
it was small, rural, small,
small
or
country
yeah,
church, yeah,
yeah,
about 75 people.
yeah.
That was all that I knew. But I felt a very clear, at the time I would describe it as a calling.
Mm.
Never for a second considered any other kind of job. So I went to a small Christian college in St. Louis, where my brother had gone, actually where our church pastors both had gone.
Okay.
We had two pastors the whole time I was growing up. They both went to the same school. And I went to actually be a preacher. I wasn't particularly excited about it. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I just felt like that was what I was supposed to do, for, I don't know any other way to describe it. So I did that and found out that I really didn't enjoy it that much. But in college, I got really, really involved in music, even more so than in high school.
Okay.
I got involved, playing drums and leading music in the church and traveling as part of some teams and things like that. So after college, I actually was a worship leader at a church for about 7 or 8 years. Had a blast doing that.
The same church that you
No, 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 totally
okay.
different church.
Okay.
This was a much larger church, where there was probably 5 or 6 staff people, and they were hiring a full-time music person. So I applied for that and got the job. And after about 8 years, I got kind of bored with that. Not because I was, Mr. Great or anything like that. It's just you can really, particularly in a role like that, I know this conversation is about ghostwriting and I'll get there
No,
eventually.
I know you will, but I
But
know that being creative means that you constantly have to rejuvenate your energies. And
yeah,
so when you say you got bored of, being a music minister, um, it was part of your evolution, I think, that
totally.
you needed to do something else.
Well, I went into that role thinking that my main attachment to that kind of role was the music because I love music. But the more that I did that over the years, I found that what I really liked more than the music part of it was the people part of it. So my last couple of years there at that church, I had interns, like summer interns, and I just really, really enjoyed teaching them, training them, getting them involved. I love the process of bringing musicians together. And, basically a church worship service is, as far as the music goes, it is about the music, but it's also about production. I mean, you're putting on an event every week, sometimes multiple events if you have multiple services. You're equipping people, you're delegating things, you're coordinating things, you're organizing. There's actually a lot of skill that goes into worship leading in a church from a production standpoint. So I found that I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And after I'd been at the church about 8 years, I decided I wanted to go into full-time teaching. So I went back to the school where I went as an undergrad, had an opportunity to do that, and did that for about 10 years at that school. I ran our music program, oversaw our chapel services twice a week, was very involved in all that stuff, and then just got really burned out on it. At that point, I had been doing music in the church for about 20 years, if you count my stuff in high school. And it was almost as if somebody had flipped off a switch. There's no other way I can really describe it. It's almost like I walked into work one day and somebody just flicked off the switch, and I was just like, I don't want to do this job anymore. And I
Wow.
think many people relate to that,
We call it
where,
burnout.
yeah, one day you're just like, something changes
Right.
and you cross some kind of an emotional threshold and you're like, I'm just done with this. So I knew at that point I had to make some kind of a change because it wasn't fair for me to stay in that role as a professor who didn't want to be teaching the stuff that he was teaching. That's not fair to students. It wasn't fair
Right.
to the school. So I was like, okay, well, now what do I do? So the nice thing, though, about teaching at a small college is that if you play your cards right, you can work yourself into a different job over time if you do it the correct way. And by the correct way, I mean, if you're nice to people and you have an academic dean who's willing to work with you,
Mm.
and you kind of, if you can propose new courses that students want to take, and you kind of have to be a little political about it, but I had a lot of fun with that aspect of it. You don't just go in and say, I think I should teach this course, because then all the faculty and academic people are going to be like, well, we don't have the enrollment to support that new course, or we haven't done that, or we tried that course back in the 80s and it didn't really work, and blah blah blah. So what I would do is I was trying to put into practice the things I was learning from business people that I was now kind of hanging around with in my side business, because I was doing a lot of podcast show notes for business clients and stuff like that. So I
Okay.
was trying to take the stuff on negotiation and persuasion that I was learning from them and put it to practice in my day job. So I would kind of talk to students and be like, hey, if we did a course on, let's say, film, like if we did a film analysis course, would you take that? Of course, students would want to take it because it sounds fun. And so then I would like put together a course, and then I would go to the academic dean, or I would go to other faculty and say, hey, I've got this idea for a course. I've got like 10 students who want to enroll, or 15 students. You think we should do it? And well, by the time you have done all that legwork, of course they're going to do it if you're persuasive and if you present your case in an interesting way.
Right.
So I almost always got new courses approved, and other faculty would be like, how come you get to teach all these fun courses?
You had a very supportive dean.
I had an extraordinarily supportive dean. But I always tried to create really good relationships with people.
Absolutely.
So especially with academic deans at a college, they're under a lot of pressure. They're juggling a lot of different balls. They've got faculty who are unhappy about things. They've got students who are unhappy. They've got other administrators who are breathing down their neck all the time about different things. They have all these constituents they really have to kind of manage.
Mhm.
So I always felt like my job was to make my academic dean's job easier. So I
Yeah.
would do whatever I could to make their job easier. So long story short, I transitioned over a couple of years into a role that was more communications, where I was doing courses on, podcasting and writing and film and storytelling and things like that. At the same time, I was also doing a side hustle where I was doing my own podcast. I was doing client work and all those things. And while our enrollment was tanking at the school, like many schools have been the last 10 years, I thought, okay, I better come up with a plan B because our school's going to go out of business at some point.
Oh, wow.
Actually, it did early this year. The
Oh,
school actually
wow.
merged with another college. So I got out just in time. But a few years ago, I saw the writing on the wall and I thought, I need to start building a business. Because I don't want to have to go just drive for Amazon or dig dishes or whatever. Not that I wouldn't if I had to. I mean, I
Right,
have no
right.
pride.
But
So
we want to be creative. We want to
I
use
do.
our
I'm
we
like,
want to use our creativity.
so if I'm going to have a business, what are the parameters that I would want to have in my business? So literally one day I sat down and I thought, okay, if I'm going to create a business, what are my non-negotiables? And I made a list of things. And then I just kind of whittled them down. And really, there were 5 things that to me were non-negotiable. One was I had to have time freedom. So I need to be able to work on my own time and my own schedule.
Okay.
Number 2 was money freedom. The idea that if I am smart and strategic, there's no ceiling on my income theoretically.
Right.
Now, of course, there's always a ceiling on income of different kinds, or maybe there's not, I don't know. But, I wasn't going to be like a billionaire doing writing for clients. But I didn't want to be hampered falsely like I always felt like I was working for somebody else.
Sure.
So that was one thing. I wanted location freedom. I could work from anywhere. I wanted to be able to focus on my main gift, which was writing. That's my main marketable skill. And then the last thing is I wanted whatever business I had to put me in the orbit of highly successful business people.
That's an
So
interesting criteria.
yeah, and all
Put
those things are
yourself in.
non-negotiable for me.
Could you explain that a bit more? Like what do you mean by that?
By non-negotiable, or do you
No,
mean putting
well,
me in the orbit
one of the
of?
non-negotiables was the last one that I was very curious
Yeah,
about. You're putting yourself in collaboration with other business.
yeah. Um, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. There's
Well,
probably
you could
not
say
a
it in a
right
mean
answer.
way. I'm a grown man.
So the crux of the issue really is that in my side business, I was spending time with people who were really big thinkers. They had their own business. These were people who were really successful authors. Many times they were wealthy. And I was like, that's the kind of life I want to have. And
Okay,
it wasn't an issue of I want to be wealthy. It wasn't really so much that. It was the idea of what if I didn't have to worry about income, and that wasn't a constant stress in my life like it had been for so long, working in a small
sure,
religious college
sure.
basically. So I saw what those people were able to do and how generous they could be to others, the cool things they were doing in their lives and businesses. And I thought, what if I could aspire to do those kinds of things? That would be kind of cool. So that's why for me, a really important criteria of whatever business I was going to have was going to be, it needs to put me in the orbit of those kinds of people, whatever shape that takes. So as I looked at all that, I thought, okay, what are the options for me? And it really boiled down to 2 things: copywriting and ghostwriting. And I chose ghostwriting actually because even though copywriting is important and it's vital, really. My perception of copywriting was that number one, it wasn't really clear. It was hard to explain to the average person what copywriting is because the average person is not in the world of marketing, or they don't think about those kinds of things all the time. So it would take me a while to explain what copywriting was. And number 2, my perception also was that you have to do a lot of different types of copywriting things. And every client's going to be different. And it didn't seem to me, at least at a beginner level, to pay all that well. Now, I could be wrong about that, of course, but that was my perception. Whereas ghostwriting to me was a simpler, more straightforward kind of a thing. Basically, where I tell people I write books for, if people ask, what do you do? I could say, well, I write books for people who don't have the time or the talent to write their own book. I can write you a book that helps promote your business, grow your income, leave your legacy, whatever it is that you want more of in life. To me, that was a much easier sell than trying to explain how copywriting works and here's why you need web copy and here's why you need to do all these other things. I'm sure copywriters would totally disagree with me, and that's totally fine.
But the way you explained ghostwriting was rather straightforward. And so
Yeah,
I write books
it's
for
a
other
super
people.
straightforward thing.
Yeah.
And I like things that are simple and direct and straightforward.
Yeah.
Also because I had written books before and I knew how that process worked more or less. And writing nonfiction books is not really rocket science. I mean, it's a very straightforward kind of a thing. You figure out who's the audience, what problem are you solving, what's the transformation you want that reader to have at the end of the book,
Mhm.
and how do you structure the book and fill in the cracks with really good content that's going to move them along that journey. It's a pretty straightforward thing, really. So that's really why I went into ghostwriting. Um,
And so you've been doing that now for,
I got into it in 2019. So really
oh, so
this
it's
is
rather
like
recent.
3 years that I've been in it, more or
Okay.
less.
Wow.
And really the two things that happened really, really helped me a lot. One was that I took a course by my friend Nick Pavlidis, who's a professional ghostwriter, and he put out a course called Ghostwriter School that was immensely helpful to me. So I went through that, took a bunch of notes. And one of the things that he talked about in the course, and this is the second thing that was really helpful, is he talks about how to market your new ghostwriting business. He didn't talk about Facebook ads or, buying Google ads or doing anything crazy. He just said,
I
tell
think
people
he
that you're
tried because
building.
I signed up. I think he tried that and he didn't get the return on investment.
Right, right.
So he doesn't emphasize that.
Yeah, he just emphasizes telling people you're building a ghostwriting business.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the simplest thing in the world. And so instead of questioning it and overanalyzing it, I just did what Nick said.
Yeah.
So plus I was really desperate at that point, to be honest with you. So I was like, okay, he's obviously really successful. I'm just going to do what he says. I'm not going to question it.
Well, can we give some backstory on his story? Because he said
Sure.
he was an attorney. He was a New York attorney for like years and
Right.
years.
Right.
And I think he kind of did what you were saying earlier. He created a list for himself, list of criteria of what he wanted to do, because I think one of his own pain points was he was spending so much time being a lawyer that he didn't have time for anything else. He
Yeah.
had family, wife, kids, and that was a real pain point for him. He wanted that
Yeah.
flexibility, kind of like what you were saying, with
Exactly.
time, with money, and even some leverage points with other professionals.
Hmm.
And so that was very much his motivation to say, and he was necessary, he was a writer, because he
Yeah.
wrote technically,
Yeah.
law stuff. And then he was also a speaker because he spoke a lot in court. And so
Totally.
he had the two essential skills that would help
Totally.
him transition into a writing career. And so
Yeah.
I think very much all the background that you bring to it and your passion for writing and for people kind of gave you that leverage to kind of move into
Hmm.
this rather successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It worked out kind of to my surprise, to be honest with you. I'm kind of shocked that it's worked out. Some
Well,
days I'm
be
like,
thankful.
I'm a little
We're supposed
surprised
to be
by
great.
this.
We're supposed to be have gratitude.
I mean, I'm immensely grateful, really. It's just, I think I'm just, I'm a self-aware enough person where I'm incredibly aware that I get in my own way every single day and that I am the bottleneck. And that if I could just get myself out of whack, then things would be so much better. So there's like just an incredible gratitude that my wife has been so patient. I've had so much help from a lot of other people. And some days I'm just like, I'm kind of surprised. This is all sort of worked out.
I like
Um,
that. I like knowing that because in our initial conversation and you recommended that I go to the school. So I did
yeah,
sign up. And so I'm
awesome.
kind of starting that journey, but I've just finished writing my first book, my own book, you know.
Cool.
So it's a leadership journey book.
Fantastic.
And then I have not so much ghostwriting, but I want to write a some other leadership type of books. And so I've
Mhm.
communicated that interest to some of my colleagues and they're interested. So they're not going to pay me to write it. So I'm going to publish it. I'm going to write it as a collaborative effort. And we'll
Okay.
probably share in, whatever income we make from the book. And that's okay too. Because I
Yeah.
have that, I want to write. I like writing.
Writing's powerful.
Yeah.
It's really, really powerful. A book is going to go places that you'll never go. And I mean, if you've got the choice between who you're going to hire, you're probably going to, for any given thing, you're probably going to hire the person who has a book, because a book demonstrates your credibility and your authority with something. And it's one of the, I think it's one of the signalers of credibility
Hmm.
or something. If you have a book about a topic that's relevant to something else that another person cares about, then it's really helpful. The majority of the time. I mean, it's not like it's a magic wand, but
Right.
it's kind of close to a magic wand.
So let me ask you, because you created the criteria, the 5 criteria that you
Mhm.
listed earlier, and now that you're in it for 3 years, did you, all the criteria that you listed, time management, money management,
Mhm.
leveraging and wanting to be in the circles of, people of influence, wealth, money, and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, are you achieving those things that you initially set out to do with your ghostwriting business?
That's a good question. Nobody has ever asked me that,
Well, that's
actually.
why I'm the question guy.
Yeah, and you're very good at it. I would say, okay. Yeah, I would say that I have on some level achieved all of those things. Um, Now, what I would add though is that I feel like I work a lot more than I used to. Now, I
But
don't mean that I
it's
work
in
all the
it's
time.
in a place of passion though.
Yeah, it's a place of it's by choice. I set my own schedule. There's nothing I quote unquote have to be at. I don't have a boss.
Right.
I do have clients who are a kind of boss, but I choose the clients and they choose me. And I have multiple clients. So, there's something nice that comes when you have multiple streams of income and multiple clients, because there's no one single force or person or company that controls your whole financial destiny.
Right.
And that's a good feeling. Some of them are bigger than others, but if you have a small income stream from something, that means you can always grow it. So it's nice to have, even if they're not very big at first, it's nice to have them there.
Have you
So
got
yeah, I would
repeat
say
customers yet? Like,
I'm sorry, what's that?
do you have repeat? One of the one of the goals of the ghostwriting school was to have repeat
Hmm.
customers, like people come back to you, and it doesn't have to be a book. It'd be any type of written content, whether it be a
Right.
blog or an ebook or just web content, because you're a writer. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what we do as writers. So do you have repeat customers?
So I had my first book that came out in 2020, my first ghostwriting book. Last year we actually did a follow-up companion journal for that book. So yes, there's another book that came out earlier this year where we're talking about a follow-up book. I just now wrapped a book, like literally last week. Wrapped a book for a client, and they're talking about doing a follow-up book with me.
Cool.
Um, so yeah, I haven't done a full like regular book for a repeating book for a client, but I'm sure that's going to happen. Probably potentially 2 or 3 of those next year. And my very first client, we were talking about doing a follow-up book at some point. So yeah, I think it'll probably happen multiple times in the next couple of years.
Awesome. And I like to hear that because like I said, I want to steer in that direction.
Yeah.
And so it's good to know from people who have the experience now that those things are possible. Those things
Yeah.
are very, very possible. I want to go back to, because you made the transition. Transitions are difficult, regardless of what we're
It can be,
transitioning
yeah.
from and to. There's a lot of things that we have to think about, consider, and plan for. But in order to be successful, people who are in transition typically need support from other people.
Mhm.
who was your team? Who was your support that helped you make this transition successful?
Well, the first one was my family. I mean, far and above anybody else, particularly my wife. So my son's 18. He was 17 when I left my job last year.
Okay.
And he saw me go through this whole process firsthand. And I think it's really helped him to understand the value of having your own business and controlling your own destiny to some extent. So I think that's made somewhat of an impact on him,
Okay.
which is good. But my wife, I mean, none of this would have happened without her, hands down. She's always been supportive of my writing, even when I did boneheaded things and ignored my writing. You know, even that summer, excuse me, even that summer when I did network marketing, you know, health products, and lost a couple
Oh,
thousand
well,
dollars.
you talked about that in our original conversation. You
Yeah.
didn't talk about it in this conversation. So you took some twists
Oh,
and
I took some
turns.
really bad pathways. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
that's
in
okay.
between, this would have been 2014, 15, 16, 17, somewhere around there. Yeah, one summer I did network marketing because somebody in my extended family, they had bought into this, and there's a million of them, company that does health products, and they were making good money from it. So I did the same thing, having no clue what I was doing, having no business doing this sort of a thing.
Right.
And I totally tanked at it. Not because the products were bad or because network marketing is bad. It's just I was bad at that.
Mhm.
And I had no idea what I was doing. Another summer, I tried selling stuff on Amazon. I shipped like 1,000 of my own books to Amazon. Did the whole rigmarole where you get the scanner, you get the heat gun, you get the wrap, you do the whole process. You ship them. You got to list all of them individually in Amazon. It's like a huge ordeal.
Mm.
And ended up losing some money. And then the worst part was that when you do the fulfillment by Amazon thing, unless they've changed it, is you ship your stuff to Amazon. So they keep your inventory. Then, of course, they ship it out. But if it doesn't sell, you have to either pay Amazon to keep storing it,
Mm.
or you have to pay to have them ship it back to you. And I didn't want it. I didn't want it in the first place. Or number three, you have to pay them to destroy it.
Wow.
So because my stuff wasn't selling, the cheapest option was paying Amazon to destroy hundreds of my own books that I had paid to ship to them.
Oh.
Now think of how insane that is. But that's what I did because that was the cheapest option. So
Okay.
I didn't when that happened, I didn't even tell my wife that I paid Amazon.
She
It
knows
was like a
now,
couple
though.
$100, and I'm like, she doesn't need to know.
Well, don't
And
have her watch this video then.
yeah, I'm sure that I told her about it
Okay.
eventually, but it was just another one of the boneheaded things that I did and I was just avoiding writing is all that I was doing,
Right.
which
Well, I'm
was
glad that
bad on
she's
my
a
part.
supporter of yours. Otherwise, this wouldn't be going so well.
Yeah, it would have been terrible, but she never ever lacked for support. The one time that she got frustrated at me was our whole marriage. I had been talking about writing a book. I always wanted to write a book, but I've always just kind of got stuck with it. And really, the whole thing that I'm doing with the Daily Writer podcast, my Daily Writer Club, my membership group for writers, is that I'm trying to help people avoid all the pain and stupid decisions that I made for so many years. I'm trying to save people the pain that I went through and inflicted on myself. But the one time that she got kind of irritated with me was so I talked about writing a book all these years, and there was one day she was making dinner in the kitchen, and I was we were just talking, and I was going on about some other book idea that I had. And, yeah, I think I should do the book about this, or I think this would make a cool book idea. And she just stopped and looked at me, and she had the look. You know what I
Uh,
mean? It's like the look of irritation and frustration.
just stop.
And I was like, what? Like, what's with the look? And she said, I've heard you talk our whole marriage about writing a book. And at this point, we'd been married probably 16 or 17 years. And she said, I'm just sick of hearing about it. Like at this point, I've just stopped believing that you're ever going to do it. So I don't even want to hear
Wow.
it.
She put it in your face.
She
Wow.
totally put it in my face.
Wow.
Now I should ask her this. I don't know if she was actually irritated or if she was trying to use reverse psychology. Whatever the case, it really
It
worked
worked.
because immediately I was like, first of all, I was irritated that she had that attitude with me. But second of all, I was like, dang it, she's right. It's like when you're mad that somebody's telling you the truth, but you know they're really telling you the truth.
Hmm.
So immediately I got busy, and I think it was really soon after that I did my first book, because I was
Well,
like, I'm going to
then
show
you
her.
owe her a big thank you.
Oh, and I've tried to repay it 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. But yeah, it's really only because of her that I have had any measure of success with any of this.
Well, good. Then you do owe her 1,000 thanks. And I'm
Oh, I
not
do.
trying to I'm not trying
Totally.
to put pressure on you. I think that's a fantastic story of having that support and having that loved one. You know, she's close to you. She's your wife.
Yeah.
How much closer can you get? And that,
Yeah.
you know, and sometimes we need that, whether it's a spouse or a friend or a mom or dad and say, you've talked about
Absolutely.
this for 1,000 years. You've never did anything about it. So either shut up or put your money where your mouth is,
Yeah.
verbatim or, figuratively. And you did it.
Yeah. She
And
was
so,
critical.
and so you made the change. So who else was your son, your wife, anybody else in your corner? So just
Yeah.
curious.
My parents have been very supportive the whole time. My mom always encouraged me to write. My dad's always encouraged me. I had the good fortune of having very supportive parents my whole life.
Good.
So that was really helpful. Also, the people at the college where I worked were very supportive. Nobody ever, they all
So,
knew that I was doing side stuff. Nobody
uh-huh.
cared. They
Okay.
Nobody had a problem with it. Um, so they were great. A lot of people, they kind of want to poo-poo their day jobs and talk bad about it, but I'm like, well, I can't really say that, because I felt the people who I worked with were really supportive. My college let me move into a role that I really enjoyed, and that kind of led into what I'm doing now in some ways.
Mm.
So I was really grateful for them. Now, part of that though also was the nature of the kind of job that I had, which was a college professor. And typically, as a college prof, you have a lot of freedom in side projects. You have some flexible time in your schedule, unless you're teaching a massive load of courses.
Well,
And they kind of expect you to write. So that I
yeah, I
was
was about to
doing things
ask you
that they
that
kind of
because
expect.
part of being in a tenured position would be to have some writing and getting it published. Was
Right.
that ever part of your
No,
responsibilities?
that was never part. I mean, we didn't have tenure at our school, so that was never a consideration.
Okay.
But and nobody ever put any pressure on us to write or do anything like that. If you did it, it was kind of cool and people loved it, and they were very supportive. Um, and it's what I think is kind of interesting is a lot of people in education, they have this idea that working for a bigger school or some big university is always better. And I don't think that's the case necessarily. I think it depends on a lot of factors. But for me, I'm really glad that I worked at a really small school, because there was a lot of flexibility. Um, I could go into, let's say, the academic secretary's office, and let's say if she put out because she would make the course schedule, if she put out a schedule that I didn't like, or that didn't work with my schedule, I could go in and I could see if she could make some adjustments,
Mm.
because maybe I had to pick up my kid at school, or I had to drop him off at school, or whatever.
Right.
And that's the great thing about working at a smaller place, is you have these personal relationships with everybody, and you can just go talk to people. You don't have to work through all these layers of administration and all this kind of stuff. Now that can have its benefits too, if you have a school that has bigger resources or bigger budgets or whatever. But for me, I just really liked working at a small school because it was way more flexible. Everybody was chill. There were, there were sometimes of the year where they didn't care if you were there or not. It's like, are you doing your job? If you are, okay. You can
Cool.
stay home, you can come in, we don't really care. I sort of like that chill environment.
Oh, I think I would appreciate that too. I just have one more question
Sure.
because I know we've been talking for quite some time.
It's all
You,
good. We can go as long as you want.
well, I appreciate that. Your podcast, you run a podcast.
I do.
You run a podcast on ghostwriting.
Well, it's on writing. It's not specifically on ghostwriting, but I do talk about ghostwriting occasionally.
Well, talk to us about your podcast.
Sure. My show is called The Daily Writer, and it's been going for a couple of years now. I've been podcasting since 2013, but I've had a few different shows. They've all kind of morphed into I would have a show for a few years and it would morph into something else and then something else, as we do sometimes in podcasting. And a couple of years ago, I decided to do a show that was focused really on writing habits and routines, because that was a big pain point in my own life. And I think one of the best ways to get better at something is to learn about it and then teach it to other people.
Mhm.
So, plus, I just like podcasting. I think it's a great medium. It's a
So
lot
do
of
you have
fun.
do you do like just talk to the camera, or do you talk like we're doing now? You have conversations with people.
Well, I do both.
Okay.
So I think it's important with podcasting is, so a lot of people just jump into doing a podcast, but I think you have to stop before you start a show, and you have to think about, what do you want the show to do for you? What do you want the show to give you? And for me, there are really two or three things that I wanted from my podcasts. One is that I wanted to connect with listeners. I also wanted it to be a way to promote things that I was doing, books or my writing community or affiliates or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
Um, I also wanted to do interviews. I think it's important to do interviews like we're doing now for your show, because that way you can connect with people. If you have a podcast, you don't have to have a huge podcast. Even if you have a show that has relatively small download numbers, you can still talk to just about anybody you want. If you have a good show and it's produced decently and you can connect with people, I mean, it's kind of miraculous when you think about it. There's no way I could I could call up. There are people who I could never call up and say, "Hey, could you give me 45 minutes of coaching advice on writing or fiction or self-publishing or
Well, they
whatever?"
would say yeah, but then they would put a
They would
dollar sign.
charge me.
Yeah.
They would charge me for it. But yet I can invite the exact same person on my show, have basically the identical conversation,
Uh-huh.
and they're happy to do it because I'm promoting them. It builds up their audience. It builds up my audience.
And
I
you just
learn.
learn
We
something.
get a new connection. It's like there's so many benefits from doing interviews. So I wanted that, but I also wanted a way to just test out content. So I use my podcast basically as um, almost like a sketch pad of ideas. So essentially, when you hear my show, it's me working on ideas, it's me testing out concepts. And if something works, then I might make that into a book or use it in my membership group or vice versa. So I just like to experiment on my podcast and see what people like. And you can immediately see what people like because you can see your download numbers.
Right.
Like, your downloads are an undeniable gauge of what people are interested in based on your title, typically. So that's one thing that I love about podcasting, is you immediately get feedback on what people like or don't like. So for all
Ain't
those
that the
reasons, I
truth?
really love podcasting.
That it really is the truth.
Plus, it's a great way to just write a book. So I'm getting ready to do a series on my podcast called. So the way that my format works, by the way, is for those who aren't familiar with the Daily Writer podcast, is I do typically 5 short episodes a week, like 2 to 3 minutes. Then I do an interview, and then sometimes I often do just like a longer teaching kind of an episode.
Okay.
And the way that I use those solo episodes is just to develop content. So because I know I've got to produce material for those episodes, that kind of forces me to do it. And so oftentimes, if I'm working on a book, I will segment that material up into little tiny chunks, and I'll use those for the podcast. Then that forces me to create it on a regular schedule, and then I can just compile that stuff into a book.
Wow.
So,
That's
and
a
then
good
if you
idea.
repurpose that onto a blog, you get even more duty out of it.
Yeah. That's perfect.
So it probably sounds like I'm very strategic with this. I'm really not. I've kind of like, after doing podcasting for a long time, I finally found a rhythm and a process that works for me. So I think you just have to do it for a little while and figure out what you like and what you don't like and what works and how you want it to help grow your business or whatever you're trying to accomplish.
But I think you have the right approach to it, because there is so much content we develop around the podcast, whether it's individual or conversation. And the Question Guy podcast is all about conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so my value here is to connect with people quite literally all over the globe and
Yeah.
have them share their story. And so from that, I get, LinkedIn content to develop. I could easily script a book or two from all of the conversations that I've had. But
Yeah.
really the value here is to allow people to really share their story. And a lot of it is the things that you just talked about, you know, the pain points of doing one thing and then growing into something else. And other people need to hear that. People need to know
Yeah.
that they don't have to be stuck in doing something that they've grown out of or have become uncomfortable with or whatever. And or they want to hear about, well, you know, what is Ken all about? You know, how can I be a writer? How can I be
Mhm.
a ghostwriter? And now we've got something else to think about, copy, because I don't even know what copy is either, other than if I were to Google it.
Yeah.
So the value that you bring now, my listeners, your listeners, our listeners, I think would help even motivate them more to kind of take some of the advice that you're giving them, some of the insights, and say, you know, I really should. Because what we don't want is for our wives to come back at us and say, you've been saying this for so long, it's time to do it. And whatever way they do it, um, that's totally what
Yeah.
we don't want.
It's so easy to get hung up. It's really, really easy to get paralyzed and you don't know what direction to go. You have all these options in front of you and you're like, okay. And we don't do anything because we're afraid we're going to choose the wrong option.
Ain't that the
But the
truth?
secret of this is that there is no wrong option. Unless you're doing something illegal or immoral or something you really stink at, there really is no bad option. Just pick something and just start, because then you're going to get some experience, and whatever you choose, it's going to grow and change over time, and that's going to lead you into whatever you need to be doing next. So there really is no wrong way to go about this. You just need to start doing something. Sitting the one huge mistake that will kill the whole thing is just sitting still and not taking any action. I mean, I had no idea whenever I started doing client work back in 2016 or so, that was podcast show notes. I mean, I had no idea I was going to do a ghostwriting career, but that was what I knew to do at the time. And that was the opportunity that was presented to me.
Mm.
And I knew I could make a little extra cash doing that. And I was like, okay, I can, at that time it was like, okay, every few months, like every 4 months, I was going to get paid whatever the amount was. I don't even remember what it was. A few $100s or something.
Mhm.
It wasn't really that much of an amount, but to me at the time, it was significant because it was something extra. So I did that, not knowing it would lead into something else, but that's what I knew what to do at the time. And then that led to other things. So I'm really thankful that I did it. I think you've got to take a step and do what's right in front of you, knowing that you're not going to stay there forever, but you're going to leapfrog to something else and then to something else and to something else.
You
And
know,
that's what has been surprising to me is that at, I'm in this ghostwriting thing now. I'm doing a podcast and a membership group and I'm writing my own stuff, but there's going to be other things that develop out of this. It's always changing. You don't ever arrive in a place where it's like, okay, now I'm set for the rest of my life, because it's all changing all the time. But if you can get comfortable with that idea of you're always going to be growing and morphing and transforming, then you're going to be fine. Just take the next logical step. But if you have to be this person who's like, okay, I've got to have everything all set, so nothing's going to change, you're going to have a really hard time with this, I think.
I think that's the truth. And my college mentor, this is way back in the day, said we're always in the process of becoming. And so
Yeah.
it just very mirrors what you just said. Kent, thank you so much for this conversation, for one, and for the insights that you provided
Thank
for
you.
two. And
Been an
so
honor.
this is wonderful. And hopefully, we get to do this again. Maybe I could be on
Totally.
your podcast as an in-kind guest. But with that, I want to say thank you for all of our listening audience, or even those who are watching on YouTube. This has been the Question Guy podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.